we're called digital power optimization, not Bitcoin miners are us. And the idea has always been that at some point in the coming years, Bitcoin mining was really only going to make sense for a large energy company, because anyone trying to buy their power as a third party is going to get squeezed out. And you really have to own the generation asset in order to remain competitive over the next 2 decades.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Andrew Weber, founder and CEO of Digital Power Optimization. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Andrew from Digital Power Optimization. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm here today with Andrew Weber, founder and CEO of Digital Power Optimization. Andrew, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Tanner. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited. We were just chatting a little bit before this call, and I think this is going to be one of the more unique kind of conversations we've gotten to have on the podcast. So I'm actually really excited to chat.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope your audience finds it to be interesting and a little bit of a different perspective on some of this.
Definitely. So, maybe just to start, if we could just hear a little bit more of your story and kind of the digital power optimization story, kind of the founding part, that could be a great place to start.
Yeah, sure. So, prior to my role in the crypto space, Bitcoin mining space, I was a finance guy, and it was 2019 when I actually really started to learn more about Bitcoin and the energy aspect of all of this and how Bitcoin is mined. And I actually was approached by a guy that I knew about using flared gas at remote oil wells as a power source for mining Bitcoin. And I had owned some Bitcoin at the time. I didn't really understand it well enough at the time, but basically did the math of looking at how you might be able to use some of this stranded energy. And so, flared gas, what that means is when you drill for oil, you want the oil, but a bunch of, methane comes up with it. And what these companies would usually do is just light it on fire. And that's the easiest way to convert it from methane, which is a really, really bad greenhouse gas, into carbon dioxide, which is significantly less bad of a greenhouse gas. So anyway, long story short, I was poking around at the idea of using this flared gas as a power source for Bitcoin mining, and others have executed on that strategy quite successfully. The challenge there is one of scale, and using small 1 megawatt generators out in the middle of an oil field in North Dakota or Alberta or West Texas.
Sure,
you can produce power reasonably cheap, but not terribly cheap. It's not an excessively cheap way of making energy at a relatively small scale. And meanwhile, I was reading articles about, in the LA Times, for example, talking about how California was having to pay the state of Arizona like $20 per megawatt hour to get rid of its excess power. California during daylight hours, because there's so much solar there, often actually has way too much power, and they have to put it somewhere. And so you pay people to take it away from you. And I was, moving these generators around the middle of nowhere thinking, gosh, it seems like these big power companies already have a lot of excess energy. Why don't we just go help them make use of it in a vertically integrated way where, they build their own Bitcoin mines and soak up all of this excess that they've got. And that was the foundation of DPO. It was the realization that, buying power from the grid or trying to create power at a relatively small scale in remote places is, interesting enough. What we think is more interesting is using Bitcoin mining as a tool to help the power sector rather than just treat them like a counterparty.
Yeah, super interesting. So what is Digital Power Optimization as a company? What are your kind of primary offerings with DPO?
Yeah, so we don't really think of ourselves as a Bitcoin miner. We're certainly not a blockchain company or a Web3 company. What we are really is an energy services provider. So if you think about most Bitcoin miners, they raise equity, they buy a bunch of computers, and then they run around to the energy sector and they say, sell us your power as cheap as we can get it from you, right? I'd like to buy your product and I'd like to pay you as little as possible, please.
That's fine.
And that's how they make their profits. We go to those same energy companies, and instead of offering to buy their power, we basically just say, why don't you build your own Bitcoin mine? And you capture all of that economic upside, and you capture all of that operating flexibility that is inherent in owning both the generation asset as well as the Bitcoin mine. And by, deploying this at a targeted size in a thoughtful way, you can actually solve some of the headaches that exist within the energy sector. Curtailments, transmission difficulties, demand response to a winter storm, et cetera. All of these are things in which, the energy companies themselves, the utilities of the world, the independent power producers, solar developers, wind developers, what have you, we think should be building their own Bitcoin mines as and where it makes sense. Now, as you would expect, many energy companies don't know much about Bitcoin. They don't know much about Bitcoin mining. And, they're not really that eager to learn. And so that's where DPO comes in, is we act as, starting off as educators / salespeople and kind of transforming into an advisor consultant kind of role. And then actually helping procure the equipment for the Bitcoin mine, building out that Bitcoin mine, and then operating it for them over the useful life of that equipment. It could be 3, 4, 5 years. So basically, we're turning energy companies, big, massive, $10, $20 billion utilities, into Bitcoin miners. And we think that's appropriate because they're the ones that have the energy headaches to solve. And if you have an energy headache, it very likely means that your power in that market or from that asset is unusually cheap. And so, again, they could sell that power to a Bitcoin miner and make a few bucks, or they could build their own Bitcoin mine and make a lot of money and have a lot more flexibility in what they do. So DPO's job is to help the energy sector think about and then actually execute this strategy on their behalf.
Love it. That's super interesting. What are these conversations like with the energy industry players about what you're doing, kind of at those earlier stages where you're kind of doing that education work, where, what typically helps kind of, because I'm assuming they're probably not crypto native most of the time. These aren't conversations they're having often, probably, even if they've heard about Bitcoin or mining or whatever. I guess I'm curious too, like what makes it click for these people, this kind of cryptocurrency mining as a service offering?
Yeah, it can run the spectrum. There's sort of a spectrum. And what it is on the far one side of it, you've got energy companies that have no idea what Bitcoin is. And then on the far other end of the spectrum, you have companies that are actively doing what we're suggesting today. 2.5 years ago, DPO was started. We started it in February 2020. So pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. The first 6 months, we were out calling companies and suggesting they do this, and we weren't getting a lot of calls back.
Sure.
I think the ones that we did, talk to, it was sort of like, what's Bitcoin? What are you talking about? They'd never even heard of Bitcoin at that point, let alone, understood the energy angle and the need for mining. And even the term mining Bitcoin, they're like, what are you digging these up out of the ground? What are you doing?
Right.
And, we would say, no, look, it's a bunch of computers running on a shelf. That's it. Like it's this global decentralized computer network. And, it's a lot of patience. It's a lot of hand-holding and a lot of time trying to be genuinely helpful and genuinely transparent with these companies. The ones that have heard more about Bitcoin, usually it comes from a bunch of inbound calls, particularly around the China ban. So when China banned Bitcoin mining in May 2021, all of these miners were instantly on the phones with every energy company in America saying, hey, I want to buy 300 megawatts of your power. Can I buy your power? Can I buy your energy?
Interesting.
And that's when several of these energy companies finally started perking up and saying, oh, what is going on here? Why are these people asking us to buy all of this power? That's an obscene amount of power for them to be buying. That's unusual. And it highlighted that there was something going on.
Yep.
And so I think, Elon Musk tweeting and Tesla accepting Bitcoin, Elon Musk tweeting further and banning, saying Tesla's not going to accept Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And then all of the news articles that have popped up over the last, year and a half, 2 years about energy consumption have really started to bring more focus and attention on this kind of component of the ecosystem. So the conversations we're having now are much more informed. The energy companies understand this a lot better. But the flip side is most of the miners that call them, they don't want the energy company to know too very much about how much money they're making or how they go about it. Again, they're counterparties. They kind of want them in the dark. And so we've taken the tactic of just being totally transparent. We show them everything. We teach them everything we can, give them as much data and as much insight as we can give them to get them comfortable and familiar. And it takes, it's not 1 or 2 phone calls. It's 10, 15 calls over 18 months. this group in the company, and then they have you talk to the lawyers, and then you talk to the engineers, and then you talk to the senior leadership, and you go back and do it all over again 6 months later. And it's an intensive, labor intensive process, but we think that a lot of the groups that we speak with really appreciate our approach, which is, again, we want them to make more money. And of course, we're going to make a buck as well for ourselves as a manager of their assets. But sure, ultimately, we do think that our strategy is the right one, rather than just, taking a blind approach and saying, I'm just going to sell power. Sure, keep selling power. That's your primary business. But if you're just ignoring completely this opportunity to, engage with Bitcoin mining in a more direct and vertically integrated way, they're kind of missing out. And I think more and more are coming around to that realization that they can't just stick their head in the sand and pretend Bitcoin mining doesn't exist. They need to understand it.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so somewhat kind of long and in the weeds question here, but I'm curious how, because I was reading this article in Power magazine where I think it was kind of a recap of a podcast you had done with them.
Yep.
And you talk about what it takes to set up a Bitcoin mining operation, and you describe it as being, pretty simple actually. And I'm reading this and I'm a little bit. I think this is kind of a multi-pronged question because I was recently reading this history of the book was called The Infinite Machine by Camilo Russo. It's a history of Ethereum actually, and there's a short chapter where they kind of cover an Ethereum mining operation in early days, and it just sounded like a huge headache, like not what you were describing for these Bitcoin mining operations. And so I'm sure this is several years in the future that we have new capabilities, and there's probably more of a market around a lot of the components, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess my question is, how do you guys specifically tackle developing capacity to deliver mining operations to clients? Like, do you work with partners? Is that in-house? Because my understanding is that it can be, you guys can kind of flex up and down in what you're delivering. And just operationally, I'm really curious about that. That seems really interesting.
Yeah, so that's a fair question. Look, I say it's not, you're not putting a person on Mars, It's just not rocket science. It's setting a bunch of computers up on a shelf in a big metal box and making sure they're, cool enough, dry, and supplied with power and internet. And that's really it. And so all of this activity around building these, from a 1 megawatt container, what looks like kind of a shipping container, it's 40 feet, 8.5 feet, it's a big metal box. They used to retrofit, shipping containers in the early days. Now there's plenty of companies that are building them from scratch, customized specifically for Bitcoin mining from the design. But basically, it's a big metal box with racks, wiring, networking equipment, cooling fans, air filtration, and you supply them with internet, you supply them with power at the appropriate voltage, and they run and they do their job. And so it's not so much that an energy company couldn't do this on their own. If they really wanted to spend the time and effort and energy, they could certainly figure this out. They could certainly do it. And in the years ahead, we think plenty will try and just do it on their own. But in the meanwhile, and probably for many of them in perpetuity, they'll just outsource it. They'll just say, hey, look, this is great. We love it. But this is going to be, 10% of our business or 5% of our business or whatever. Why don't we just partner up with DPO to have them take care of all this activity for us? So what we do have in-house expertise. We've hired a number of project managers. We actually just hired recently the head of site operations from Hut 8. Hut 8, for those who don't know, is a big public Canadian Bitcoin miner. They've been around longer than most and have been public for longer than most. So definitely have the in-house expertise here to actually, plan the development, design it, procure the equipment for that development, working with a number of different, equipment providers, both from the transformers, the switch gear, all of the electrical infrastructure, the containers to house the ASICs, the computers themselves, all of it. And you basically, it's a logistics operation basically, and you're pulling all of these elements together, hiring on-site, state licensed local contractors to do the electrical certifications and installation, et cetera. But by and large, the infrastructure that you're using from site to site and from place to place stays kind of similar. You're supplying these computers with relatively low voltage power, and you have to transform it from high voltage down to that level to make it work. There's considerations like noise. There's considerations like heat management. Again, mining in West Texas is a lot different than mining in Alberta, Canada. And the summer temps can change the way that you might have to deploy that. You might have to use an immersion cooling system rather than an air cooling system. But again, these things are all things that have been done for decades now. People have been producing power for 100 years. They've been moving power from here to there and transforming it up and down into various voltages. And, frankly, running data centers isn't even that particularly new. So it's a lot of logistics, it's a lot of organization, and you have to have a professional and institutional way of doing this and planning it out and being thoughtful. But in the end, it's not rocket science. I'll put it that way.
Okay. Yeah. Super interesting. So what's been most surprising in your journey since founding DPO in 2020, where, the origin of something like DPO's usefulness to clients seemed to have been very intuitive and obvious to you at the beginning, but surely there's been some interesting surprises along the way that have shaped the ultimate trajectory of where you're at now and kind of where you're going too.
Yeah, there absolutely have been. And in fact, the last 2 years in particular, if you just look back, from October 2020 until October 2022, Bitcoin ripped from, the high teens up to what, 40,000, and then came back to the low 30s, high 20s, whatever it was. And then, bounced again back to 60,000. And then now we're back down at 20. So I think Bitcoin's spot price movements have been, they're always volatile, right? Everybody, I think, realizes that. But I don't know if everybody was particularly ready for the degree of moves and how quickly and sharply some of that happened. The conversation around the energy usage and energy consumption, and is this green? Is this, a good or bad use of energy? You look at Ethereum, the merge, and how that is now, a proof of stake network versus the proof of work network. I think, and then you have the broader macroeconomic backdrop with the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, all the central banks around the world and some of the actions they're taking today. And energy prices. Energy prices have moved dramatically over the last, 12 months. It's much, much higher than people anticipated, 12 months ago. And so you see a lot of these bankruptcies happening in the Bitcoin mining space, the crypto mining space, where Compute North has filed for bankruptcy. You saw a warning by Core Scientific just the other day about them maybe not making interest payments in November. So, I think the world has been particularly volatile, and a lot of the things that we're working on, that's influenced us heavily. But we haven't really pivoted. We haven't really changed our strategy. We're called digital power optimization, not Bitcoin miners are us. And the idea has always been that at some point in the coming years, Bitcoin mining was really only going to make sense for a large energy company, because anyone trying to buy their power as a third party is going to get squeezed out. And you really have to own the generation asset in order to remain competitive over the next 2 decades. So some of this happened faster than we might have expected, but by and large, we've always understood that eventually margins in this space were going to narrow. And when that happened, the only way to really compete, the thing that you can really manage and actually compete against others, is your cost of power. And so the search for ever cheaper, more stranded, more renewable power for this sector is never going to end.
Yeah, super interesting. So kind of on that same note, what does the next 5 years look like for DPO if everything goes well? This volatility is super real, and the macro environment it hits you guys in a lot of different ways, or impacts you guys in a lot of different ways. But I guess, are there any specific obstacles you're foreseeing or opportunities you're excited about?
I think generally the institutionalization of all of this, I think Bitcoin and crypto has had this sort of anti-institutional feel to it for a very long time. And, the early cypherpunks and what have you that were, I think building these systems as an escape to traditional finance I think it's still very fair. And I applaud that effort to bring this to the mainstream. But the reality now is that large institutions are kind of picking up and running with this baton. And I think that's where this is going to play out, is that, the guys mining Bitcoin in their basement, it's just not cost competitive for them to do that. And even the large Bitcoin miners that are buying power from the grid, these are still relatively tiny companies, right? These are $1 billion companies, $500 million, 1.5 billion. Sounds big, but in the end, compared to Walmart or compared to Microsoft or Exxon, like these are relatively tiny operations. And so again, we kind of think that over the next 5 years, the next 10 years, or even 20 years, more and more of mining, Bitcoin mining, will actually happen at the energy company level. A major utility that does things in a very institutional way, highly regulated. They have a very low cost of capital. They have the energy headaches to solve. And so, again, we think that one of the more interesting things happening in Bitcoin mining in particular is this migration from being done by third-party entities that call themselves Bitcoin miners, and more of it is going to be done by companies that call themselves energy companies. So that could take a long time. It really depends. If Bitcoin rips to 300,000, it may accelerate that process. It may actually delay that process depending on how some of these guys think about it. But I guess I would say this: when Bitcoin is at 60,000 and all of the Bitcoin miners are making a huge amount of money, the difference between $30 power and $50 power just doesn't really move the needle that much. It's kind of an afterthought.
Sure.
When margins are compressed because Bitcoin, has pulled back to 20 and a bunch of new competitors have been added to the Bitcoin mining network, margins are thin, and the difference between $30 power and $50 power is massive. And so if you're mining on $50 power and you've got competitors mining on $30 power, you're not going to be feeling so good in the years ahead. So again, I think it's that a shift toward more renewable energy, a shift toward more flexibility in the way that this is deployed. I think there will be smaller Bitcoin mines, 10, 15, 20 megawatts spread all over the place behind the meter at generation assets, and less of it just being done at 300 or 500 megawatt scale on grid power. So a lot of things coming, a lot of things to change, but you're going to see bigger organizations kind of pick up this baton.
Yeah, super interesting. So I typically kind of at this point like to ask kind of any advice for founders building in the Web3 space, given this is kind of a Web3 focused podcast. But I think I'd want to generalize it a little bit more to just any advice for founders, just founders in general, anything that stood out as especially helpful or interesting to you kind of in your past couple of years journey as a founder of DPO?
Yeah, good question. It's a lot harder than I thought, to be perfectly honest. I worked in Wall Street at Goldman Sachs. I worked in a number of different hedge funds and private equity groups. And you'd see these guys in the tech space, making these $100 million companies and selling them, or the unicorn $1 billion companies. And it's hard. It's a tricky thing. You have to be flexible. You have to be thoughtful. You have to really find your niche of where you're adding real value and how you can differentiate yourself from some of your competitors and peers. And so, again, we certainly are not a Web3 company. We follow that space pretty closely just, for our own understanding of it. But I think, that general advice across the spectrum is, figure out what value your company is really meant to add, and focus on that, and really play up to that strength. We are very focused on our specific strategy of helping energy companies. I think there's a lot of different ways a Bitcoin miner or a company like ours might be able to make money and insert themselves and create value. But I think finding that differentiated approach and finding that that real understanding of what service and what product you're offering and how that benefits your customers is vital. And listening to your customers, we get feedback all the time where maybe they're not ready for our primary business model. And we say, look, we get it. You'll get there in 3 years. You'll get there in 5 years. We get it. You're just not there today. Let us stay in front of you. Let us continue to nurture this relationship. And as you get closer, we'll be in a position to do it. So, I like what we're doing here because it's one of the few times in my career where I've found you can create deals that are legitimately kind of win-win-win. Where the power company wins, DPO wins, the energy asset wins, the Bitcoin mining industry wins by converting this into more and more an energy product. So yeah, I think remaining flexible, but still remaining true to that core thesis and that core understanding of what is it that you're doing that's adding value to the world, and focus, intensely on that element and make sure you're better at it than everybody else.
Yeah, that's great advice. So, Andrew, maybe last question here. What are you guys working on right now, and what's the best way for people to both follow along the journey and maybe get involved in different ways as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, follow us on. We got a LinkedIn page. Happy to have people following us there to see. We try to post pictures of some of our deployments and show people the things we're working on. As an entity, we think we've set up on a broader variety of energy assets than almost anyone else out there. We've done a pilot for one of North America's top 10 solar developers. We've done a pilot. We're actually doing a pilot right now. It's actively running for $10, $15 billion publicly traded utility. We've got a couple more projects with some really big utilities that are thinking through this and figuring it out. So we own our own hydro asset in Wisconsin. We've run on hydro. We've run on wind power. We've run on solar. We have run on grid power. We've run on natural gas. And so we've got a pretty broad experience with a lot of different types of generation assets, which really helps us with our customers and teaching them where this fits best with their goals and their generation portfolios. So I think you'll see more of that. We've actually not put out as many news releases and announcements as some others in the Bitcoin mining space. And I think those that consider themselves Bitcoin miners have an incentive to talk about their larger deployments and all of the interesting stuff they're doing, helps them raise more capital, et cetera. Our clients and customers like to stay quiet. None of them really want to talk about this yet. They're learning and they're figuring it out and they're getting themselves comfortable before they start, making waves publicly about what's going on here. So, we are working with a couple of utilities that I think are in the final stages of building out, or thinking through the build out of some decent sized commercial projects, which, as far as we know, they'll be some of the biggest, maybe the biggest utility owned Bitcoin mines on Earth. And they're not ready to talk about that yet. So we keep their names out of the press and marketing that we do, but happy to keep people on our distro list. We do send a monthly update with some materials. So if anyone listening wants our monthly update emails, reach out and let me know. Our website, digitalpoweroptimization.com, has all of our contact info. We'd love to sign you up and let you follow along. So yeah, I think we'll hopefully have more and bigger, interesting news items to announce over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. But we're in quasi stealth mode, if you will, where we like to tell people what we're doing, but our partners don't. So we have to stay pretty quiet on their behalf for now.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for the time. This was really, really interesting and kind of a world I don't know too much about. And so really appreciate the opportunity to get to learn from what you guys are doing too. So thanks so much for coming on the show and have a great week.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.